I had just learned about an institution that was operating in like the early 1900s called the Simplified Spelling Board. The only reason I know about this is because it came up as a chapter or two in this absurd 3-volume dad book, Teddy Roosevelt biography I'm reading. But essentially in like 1905, 1906, a bunch of prominent figures led by Andrew Carnegie, and I think working with the New York Times or a New York Times editor or something else like that, proposed a across-the-board standardization of English written orthography to be used in all federal documents.
Huh.
And they issued an initial 300 words and then 600 words, and then they had people taking public pledges to use these things. And a lot of them are like, for example, any like the past, the suffix, the ed would just be a T. Lots of like diphthongs with like weird sort of like orthographies would be simplified. So boat also would just be BOT. And Roosevelt, again, like what the reason I'm telling you is of course, everyone on the board, all the people involved in this are men. And they're all men that are, among other things, using correspondence to one another in this like weird language, or like this like not like it's like not a pidgin English, but it's like a simplified English or like simplex English or whatever, to correspond to one another as they're like, we need to build more battleships, we need more battleships, we need more ammunitions, all this stuff. And Roosevelt
more
will then
boats,
more
B-O-T.
boats, yeah. And Roosevelt, even I think on one or two occasions, signs it his last name RUSEVLT or something like that. And it eventually there's a tremendous backlash to this, and ultimately people like abandoned it. But the reason I was thinking it in relation to you, well, so many reasons, but one, it was like, I really want to know if there were crosswords done in this during this period. Or I really also want to know about just like so much of the histories you give, whether philosophical, right, and in the pages of theoretical tomes, or ludic, but also very serious in the pages of crossword sections or crossword books. You're engaging with women who are working with and trying to transform the strictures of language or like play with language and all this stuff. And then to have at a century earlier, from where we stand now, this extremely homosocial group of extremely aggressive and conservative men essentially legislate like baby talk to one another. I don't know. I just wanted to. I can send you the sources on this. I'd be curious what you think.
Please do.
It blew my mind. Yeah.
I mean, it reminds me of just various efforts to kind of create a standard or universal language, right?
Yeah.
Ostensibly for the purpose communication, but like of course within a narrow set of people, and all determined by the forms of technology current at the time. So I wonder if that's like for the sake of reducing printing costs, right? Because it's like fewer letters.
It was all military. Yeah. It was like, we're going to save this much on typeface. It's going to be faster to learn. There'll be fewer confusions.
Yeah, but there is something about are you Roosevelt that like does seem like he's something about the phonetics of it does seem like, oh, I bet that's how he wrote his name when he was a toddler.
Yes.
Seemed like Roosevelt hooked on phonics.
Yes. Yeah, yes, exactly. And any double vowel words would be gone.
Right.
The rich history of our language that makes it such a playground for orthographic, like it would just be, I don't know. I don't know. I've never actually played Wordle, but maybe it would be more of a Wordle type space here, Abby, with this. I don't know. Can you?
I don't Wordle either. Okay. I was just gonna ask it. I wanted to ask Anna, if you do Wordle, is there a war between like crossword people and Wordle people?
There's no war.
There's no war. There's overlap.
There's total.
Okay.
Although I will say we just underwent a restructuring of puzzles at the New Yorker, where there are now fewer large crossword puzzles and more of these small ones, like Wordle and Spelling Bee and the mini, which means less money for me, but I think it's a function of, I don't know, shrinking attention spans. I think more people will do the smaller puzzles, which crossword puzzles, all puzzles are a waste of time. So it's kind of depressing that way more efficiently. It's really perverse. But yeah, so no rivalry, although I guess we are at some level competing over resources from these magazines and newspapers.
I was thinking about it because I was watching the video of Colin Jost doing the White House Correspondents' Dinner.
I watched that too,
and I thought the funniest.
Why did they do that?
It's such a great question, Anna. But I thought the only joke that was really funny was the like, oh, the Washington Post is here, right? Fox News is here. The New York Times is here.
We actually had a strange moment. I read about this a little bit at the start of the pandemic when the Times bought Wordle for $1 million+.
Right.
And, at the time, crossword constructors at the New Yorker, at the time, $300 per puzzle. And so there was some organizing around whether or not we should be getting more money for our efforts, especially since we were effectively underwriting all of the investigative journalism.
Seriously.
But also we were hoping to institute or demand or ask for certain changes at the paper that would make it a better work environment for us. In part, like I had the experience, another woman, Claire Muscat, who reached out to me, had the experience of sort of being asked to be an assistant to the editor there, but sort of as like a woman's censor, like to make sure that nothing was too sexist that went through.
Sensitivity reader, crossword sensitivity reader.
We were crossword sensitivity readers. But then at the same time, we also felt, or I can just speak for myself, that our intelligence wasn't really valued. Like it was very circumscribed work. You're not really here as one of the puzzle experts so much as a censor, right?
Or as
which
a
is just a shitty way to feel. Right, of course, right, yeah. And to be a representative for all women solvers who continue to make up at least half of all solvers.
Right.
So we also asked for some changes that would build out the editing staff and team so that there would be more. No one would have to stand in for any subject position.
Yeah.
And I think all of those asks and demands were basically met. And, it's I think a function of like our having some leverage at that moment because puzzle subscriptions were way up during the pandemic. I mean, This is where we go back to the truism of Margaret Farrer, the first crossword editor of the Times, who said, you can't think of your troubles while solving a crossword puzzle. That's why, we see the puzzle be invented at the start of World War I. It's instituted at the Times at the start of World War II. Subscriptions go way up at the start of the pandemic. There's a kind of like history of national trauma that tracks alongside the crossword puzzle.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am delighted to introduce Anna Shechtman. Anna is a Klarman Fellow at Cornell University, where she will be joining the Department of Literatures in English this fall. Anna's research on the history of the media concept has been published in Critical Inquiry and Representations, and her freelance essays and reviews have appeared in Artforum, The New Inquiry, The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the Yale Review, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, where she is an editor at large. She writes crossword puzzles for The New Yorker, and her book, The Riddles of the Sphinx, Inheriting the Feminist History of the Crossword Puzzle, was published in just March of this year. Anna, welcome. We're so happy you're here. We loved your book. We're really excited to talk with you.
Thank you so much. You are truly ideal readers for this very strange book that I wrote. So I'm really excited to talk to you about it.
This is not, I have other questions to start off with, but I just want to first compliment you on somehow getting a press to allow you to write an entire chapter about Lacan and French feminism, because I don't know how you did that.
Yeah, I mean, I have various ways of talking about this book, and I try to sort of figure out where someone's interest may lie, and then if it seems like they're really interested in crossword puzzles and the history of the puzzle, sort of describe the historical arc that runs through the project that way, and then say and there's a side of mental illness and Lacanian psychoanalysis, sort of frantically, so that they're not too surprised or upset or disappointed once they reach that chapter.
Another feature of the book that I think I would like to ask our audience to consider is for people who may have an interest in psychoanalysis but no interest in crosswords would actually find, I think, you make a powerful case for material and like incidental, thematic, and historical, and just like ongoing psychodynamic reasons for why crosswords are salient. And I promise I don't want to read too many sentences from your book and be like, oh, this is beautiful prose. But since we already have Cixous and Irigaray, and we have a little bit of Lacan on the table, right? And I want to say that like you produce some bits in here that are evocatively beautiful in this generative way that reminds me of them, while also being comprehensible and suggestive, and that speak to this sort of the psychodynamic or psychoanalytic noteworthiness of crosswords. So if you'll permit me, I just wanted to read this one little bit. And then
Please, yeah, that's really nice. Thank you.
And this is when you're describing a diagramless puzzle still featured in the back pages of many New York Times Magazine issues, looks like a blank 15 by 15 square grid. But it is no tabula rasa, blank slate. Instead, it has already been imprinted with black squares and answers that have been erased, or, if you prefer, repressed. The solver needs to discover the answers and the placement of the black squares in order to bring the latent puzzle to the grid's surface. What looks like a wide open grid, an expanse of freedom, is originally, but subliminally, rule bound. I was like, that's beautiful. And it works. It does work to express. It does work thematically for thinking about psychoanalytic development, for thinking about transferential relationships, for thinking granularly about a theorist like Lacan and why language is both a metaphor and more than it for him. But it just, I was like, I did not expect to get all the things that I got out of this book, and the things that it delivered for me were things that I didn't even anticipate that I was going to get. So I just want to register that right up front before we get into our other questions.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, that passage comes in the context of writing about one woman. Her name was Ruth Hale, but it sort of stands in as a motif for all the women I write about, all of whom who have great privilege. I mean, they're white women, they're women of means, they're highly educated, and yet they're really disturbed, all of them, myself included. And I think my hope is that they've been informed in some way by the sense that they have nothing but expanse ahead of them, right? They have all of this opportunity and privilege, and yet they're navigating certain social demands and norms has led them to really come up against the rule bound, the subliminal rules that are actually shaping their ability to, be successful, like conspicuously smart women. So yes, the diagramless puzzle is definitely a kind of ongoing motif throughout the book. And also it's a strange book. So I want you to feel like, okay, where is this going? There is some method to the madness. It's just under the surface.
So I want to ask you to tell our listeners, because the book is new. Most people will not have yet had a chance to get their hands on it, although you all should. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your new book, which is called The Riddles of the Sphinx, Inheriting the Feminist History of the Crossword Puzzle? And because, we are playing in the psychoanalytic sandbox, I want to ask you to tell us a little bit about what crossword puzzles have to do with psychoanalysis. I mean, we're all guilty of reading in to our own preoccupations to books, but I don't think I'm reading in too much to say that this book, which involves a certain amount of excavation, both of the often forgotten history of women in crosswords and also of your own struggles with anorexia. It's quite haunted by Freud, in addition to the more explicit engagement with the so-called French feminists, Julia Kristeva, Luce Irigaray, and Hélène Cixous, two of whom are analysts, and of course, Jacques Lacan. Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, of course. I started writing crossword puzzles when I was 15 years old, which is just a peculiar fact of my biography. And at a certain point, it became incredibly clear to me that I was one of very few women who write them, largely because once I started writing them for the Times, other outlets approached me to write them in order to sort of diversify their bylines, right? So I was asked to not just write crosswords, but there's some sense that I should be writing sort of women's crosswords. So what is women's language? What words index a kind of woman's worldview? Was something that was kind of brought to me as a function of this fact of my biography. But I also knew that there was this, that actually crosswords used to be understood as women's work. And I knew that through this kind of mountain of ephemera, whether it was cartoons or postcards or novelty songs that suggested that like the crossword puzzle, when it was invented in 1913, was associated with not just any women, but with new women, with sort of modern flapper figure, someone whose desires to date and work and fuck were as sort of inscrutable to patriarchy as this new crossword form itself. So there's like a very strange, I think at the time quite popular 1925 novelty song called Crossword Mama.
You go out calling for an hour or two. I don't know where or when or how or who. Crossword Mama, you puzzle me. But Papa's gonna figure you out.
But Papa's gonna figure you out, right? And so I was sort of interested in that. How is it?
What do they
yeah,
want?
exactly. What do they want, right? Which is the question that haunts all of psychoanalysis, right? And so that was fascinating to me. How is it that an industry kind of masculinizes in this way? Why did it go from being women's work to now something that, less than 20% of Times puzzles are now written by women? And then the other sort of motivating question of this book, again, stemmed from my personal history, which is that almost to the day, I started writing crossword puzzles and I stopped eating. And I knew that these phenomena were linked. I knew in some way that they were both sort of willed efforts to demonstrate something like mastery over these unmasterable forms, whether it's the body of language or my own body. But it was hard for me to articulate it. Like, why did I develop very willfully an eating disorder and also start writing crossword puzzles, especially because I wasn't writing them for anyone. I wasn't trying to get them published.
Mm-hmm.
I was just trying to get words to cross in my like graph paper notebook from geometry class. So these two histories, one, which is the larger history of the kind of masculinization of the puzzle industry and the strange history of different women who kind of like me were using the crossword puzzle to negotiate, their relationship to symbolic law.
Yeah.
Those are the two sort of threads that run throughout the book, my own story, and then this other history with these other women who, I'll say my mom finally read a copy of the book when I was done writing it, and she was like, "Well, I buy your thesis and you're all nuts." The thesis being something like, that word games in general have, and crossword puzzles in particular, have been this perverse site for me and other women to negotiate something like the riddles of the Sphinx, right? The conflicting imperatives of being women, of being ambitious women, being smart women in our culture. We're all nuts.
We are here on Ordinary Unhappiness pretty obsessed with Freud, not a secret. And in particular, we have sort of an affinity for early Freud. And in reading your book, I was thinking about, and because you also are, an English professor and literary critic, I was thinking a lot about the uses of Freud and early Freud for literary criticism, and thinking about, the idea of displacement, one of the mechanisms of the dream work, according to Freud, which I've always thought is the most important of them for a literary critic. The ability to realize that what seems most marginal is actually central, and vice versa. And so, which gives us the ability to look at seemingly throwaway moments within a text and be like, no, that's it. That's the heart. And I had that experience when I ran across that anecdote in your book, where you're poking fun at your early, kind of gentle fun, I think, at your earlier self for taking it as a compliment when a therapist says that you're intellectualizing, as opposed to like that they, are saying this is a defense mechanism. And I personally did feel so much for this earlier version of Anna, speaking as somebody who, I can see Patrick laughing at me right now, who prefers to take flight into theory rather than talking about my feelings directly. But, when you're recounting it, it's not just about therapy, right? And it's also not just this story about recognizing a defense mechanism and working with it throughout recovery. Although you do tell this story in a way that's both lovely and painful. But, and I promise I'm finally getting to the question here.
No, please, this is great.
It underscores this anecdote, this tension that I think just lives throughout this book. The ways that thinking and feeling and mind and body can war with each other, right? And so, sure, like, in that moment, and probably in a lot of other moments, you're intellectualizing, right? But also you are an intellectual. You're a professor. You're a literary critic. You're a writer. And this is a scholarly project as well as a memoir. So it's not like, it's not Brené Brown. It's not like you show up and now you're in this world of pure unmediated feeling and everything is resolved or solved, right? So can we talk about the ways in which this book, which is so consumed by words and wordplay, is also a kind of meditation on how sometimes we have to feel by thinking or think by feeling?
Yeah, what a hard, and for me, I think, intractable question, right? What is the relationship between thought and feeling, and especially as someone who, like you guys, has been pretty obsessed with Freud and psychoanalysis from, I think, a fairly young age.
Yeah.
Like, how has my desire to understand the complexity of subjectivity actually only made it harder to understand, because I'm sort of deferring contact with feeling by retreating into thought, right?
Yeah.
That's something that is like a persistent worry of mine, right? That now that I've maybe stopped seeing intellectualizing, who knows if I've actually stopped seeing intellectualizing as a compliment, right? I obviously heard it as like, oh, you're so smart. But throughout the book, I try also to take seriously language and its distortions. So, it's not just the confusion between intellectualized or, strange misreading or malapropism that I performed there. It's also, there's another sort of foundational one, which is the confusion or recognition between being perfectionistic and being perfect. That was another really meaningful or overdetermined misunderstanding that I think, I don't know if it was willful but when I heard that, anorexics were most likely, in a way that's actually just, I want to say, not true, but I read in a high school textbook that anorexics usually conform to certain traits. And one was that they were high achieving and usually affluent, usually white, usually women, and also that they were usually perfectionistic. And I really latched onto that last word and infused it, I'm sure, with a tremendous amount of feeling. But I was very much trying to construct an image of a perfect girl. And, various times I wonder what would have happened. I'm sure many of us do this. We run through our personal history and we kind of think the counterfactuals, right? What could have prevented me from falling into this really pernicious eating disorder? And one of them is like, what if I had just gone to my parents or anyone and just, I'm really sad, right? What if I didn't require a different vocabulary, one that was more clinical, or I don't know, at the time, I'm sure I thought more sophisticated, like I'm really perfectionistic, right? And instead said, like, what if I'm actually really sad? And I'm still very uncomfortable with that register of feeling. I still tend to think like I can tell someone I'm depressed rather than tell them I'm sad. And that seems to me also to have a ton to do with gender. Something about the sort of squashy femininity of some of the language we have around feeling has always repelled me. And it's actually, this is jumping ahead. It's one of the reasons I think I was so captivated by Lacan and Lacanian feminism in particular, is that there seemed to be a way forward that was sort of like choosing door number 3, right? Like you don't have to be a feminist who is super sentimental about feelings and Brene Brown, as you say, right?
I know. I realized I just did that. I just did the like squishy.
No, you totally right. Like there's a sort of, I want to repudiate. That's actually not how I talk about my relationship to my gender. Mine is much more rigorous than that, right? But there's, and there was another register that I also wasn't comfortable with, which I think has everything to do with the kind of feminist vacuum of the early aughts that I was raised in, right? Which is like, I'm strident or I'm sort of aggressively political. And what I liked about the French feminists, and this is just in some ways, I think, a misappropriation of them, is that they seem to offer this third way, right? Which was like wiliness, right? You're not in the world of, you're not in the world of logos, the like agitating for access to power, right? And you're not in the world of pathos, the like world of feeling and sensation. You're in the world of, deconstructing the binary, right?
Yeah.
And that somehow you have access to a form of liberation that's all based, and even a form of liberation and also a form of like highly feminine pleasure, which is like a whole other thing, right? But that's all manipulated through like brain power and playing with words and making jokes and kind of being a troll, actually. And that it was like this way that I could negotiate between thinking and feeling, and still claim to be a feminist. And I don't know if you can tell by the tone of my voice, but I basically think that was like wrong and bad. And that at some level might work in this, or rather it was like a compromise to patriarchy, that I was like, I want to still sound super smart in ways that are legible to like my male professors. And not walk into the classroom and say like, I'm really sad, or walk into the therapist's office and say, I'm really sad. Like that's not a register that I'm comfortable occupying. And, I think it is like actually a valid critique of the French feminists to say that their wordplay was actually in the service of something like heterosexual foreplay. Like they're always trying to turn on their readers in ways that are in weird ways courting male desire and attraction. We can like talk more about that. But this is a long way of saying that like there's some part of working through both registers. So like, let's just be clear. What I want is access to power. Let's like double down on logos. Yeah. And let's also be really clear. I'm super fucking sad. Let's double down on pathos without having to like repudiate either of those desires, because they seem to be really, not compatible with this more fundamental desire, which is that like, I want to be feminine in a patriarchal world and I want to be smart in a patriarchal world. And both of these modes, give me power, I'm sad, are like disqualifying to men,
Yeah.
There's so much at work in what you're saying. And one thing that sort of occurs to me, and I think this will probably be familiar for people who have listened to some of our episodes, and particularly the call-in episodes, right, is the way in which, well, the first thing you describe is like this, the way in which experiences of personal distress or pain, whatever their origin, in the family system, in the body or whatever, become rendered as intelligible through an act of identification with a diagnostic category, right? And
totally.
And I think that part of, well, I'm drawn to both in your story as you've related it in the book and as you relate it now, but also in terms of the misgivings that you relate about like that, or the tragedy of this, like, why couldn't you just go to your parents and say this thing, right? Like, I'm trying to think, like, why did I have to? This is my not issuing a crude simplicity here between anything I've experienced and you, but like, I'm trying to think, like, why did I take up smoking like clove cigarettes instead of just being like, I'm really sad, right? I have depression. Can we please like? No, I'm just going to sit here and look sad and fucking, I'll smell great, but I'm going to be like,
that's debatable. It's debatable.
Oh, okay. Well, I just remember these like that's like I'm coughing up like a chai latte from hell at the end of it, but that was fine. But like it's like why does it have to be mediated through this thing, right? And I guess with that, whether it's the example of like the trope of the rebelling teenager or the limits of diagnosis or self-diagnosis, and I'm not judging anyone for anything they do, but like the drama seems to be a species of what is sort of play in the motif of like the puzzle with the blank, the predetermined connections and exclusions. And so like you see yourself as this thing. Okay, it's clarifying to me that I'm not going to be depressive, right? And I don't know, as I made that decision, I didn't necessarily co-sign what the medication was going to do to me, right? I didn't necessarily realize how that might affect implicate my ability to appreciate a sad novel or something else, right? There are these like hidden riders or exclusions that accompany both this very necessary desire to individuate and to define yourself through mediation, but that also can kind of hobnoble or catch you in that. And to kind of extend this, I see this working at play with your turn to French philosophy too. And I'm not saying in any way that that's like that offers another set of explanatory schemas, and it defines and speaks to the properly existential and lived stakes of what you're are going through at the time as you sort of turn to those texts. But it dramatizes and gives you yet another perspective for thinking through those problems.
There's something about, and we will, dear listeners, we will in a few minutes say a little bit more about the set of texts that we're talking about like who the French feminists, which is like, it's like an old Saturday Night Live bit. Like we're neither really French nor really feminists in some cases.
Really feminist.
Like we'll get to that. But there is this way in which when you start to look to identify or to work through your own self-narration in terms of really difficult texts that deliberately stymie meaning and intelligibility, there's a kind of solace to that, which is this kind of solace I think you can actually get from Freud too, which is we are infinitely complex and unintelligible. And that is, there feels like, and I'm thinking about how our mutual friend Hannah Zeven always says that psychoanalysis doesn't condescend, that there's a way in which, reading some of these French feminist theorists who are analysts also, and using that language rather than I am sad, it has a certain kind of dignity.
Yes.
Like it doesn't have to be like, we don't have to code it necessarily in terms of like rigor or sophistication. It can be this idea of like, I am like of singularity and infinite complexity. And maybe you're at some point misreading certain texts. Show me a 20-year-old that's not misreading certain texts for their own purposes, or 40-year-old, right? This is not we're all guilty of it. But, I think if you're going to choose a set of texts to play with in terms of your own identity, you could do worse than pick ones that say, no, I go on forever.
I think that's probably right. Although I do think there is something of a clove cigarette to my relationship to these texts, though. I mean, the diagramless puzzle continues to be a good metaphor, I think, because when you're thinking about the process of identification, right? You at some level there's this strange paradox or dialectic at work, right? Where you're like, I'm of infinite complexity, and on the one hand, this mode of identification is going to simplify things for me, right? Like I'm going to be this.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, like what you're saying, Abby, is that you're also looking to develop your complexity.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, but then what happens, or at least what happened to me and what I hope to narrate throughout the book is like, you then look up in the world and you're like, oh shit, I'm just another clothes-smoking teenager,
No, I'm a basic bitch. Right. Yeah.
I'm a basic bitch. Yeah. And like, there's like somehow
just in French,
the modes of alienation that happen. Yeah, totally, exactly. Yeah. Which means you can't be basic, right? But the modes of identification and then like the realizing, oh no, I'm so alienated from that, from what surfaced in the diagram with crossword puzzle. Like, okay, so now the latency has risen to the surface, and I'm like, oh shit, I'm crossword girl. Like, how did I do that? And why am I so alienated from that? Or as my sister used to always say with regards to my eating disorder, like, couldn't you have been more original? Like, you're really gonna be an anorexic Jewish girl from Lower Manhattan? Like, that's the form that your complexity takes. This like really otherwise, like actually really rigid template that's right there in your health class textbook. I mean, that's the paradox, is that in looking to develop or unveil your complexity, you actually end up like the black squares that were always there come to the surface. And you're a teenager reading Nietzsche and smoking a cigarette. And I don't know if you're reading Nietzsche, but you probably were.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
I wonder.
absolutely.
I wonder, like, part of what I'm thinking about here too, just kind of riffing on this without necessarily knowing where it'll lead, is I think it's really interesting how the work that you do and that you describe, right, as a crossword constructor, as a cruciverbalist, right? I love that word too.
I'm
right?
so glad you got to use that. To
Get that word in there.
Yeah.
Good.
That was new to me. I learned that word from this book.
Oh
yes.
yeah, me too. Like this experience.
I
of,
like that it sounds kind of violent.
It really does, actually. It's like you're nailing them to crosses.
Super metal.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. Oh, so what I was thinking, you described this experience of being like, oh, like at least my suffering is interesting, right? Is this like conviction, right? I get to choose it, right? And I found myself very touched and spoken to and implicated by your times you talk about like the attachment to where you describe like protecting your anorexia from people who love you, right? Or like trying to in different forms to perpetuate a certain type of relationship to eating and to, even as that is harmful to you, you hold on to it it's an object that's actually intervening in your relationship to others in some way, right? And that a lot of that involves dissimulation and hiding and all this, as you narrate so painfully and I think bravely. So there's that, right? The singularity of attachment to like, this is my psychic pain. It's mine, right? There's an old Stephen Crane poem, I think, right? Like one where he's like, I came across a man in the desert eating his heart. And I was like, why? And the man says like, because it is so bitter and because it is mine or something, right? It's like, it's me. I get to keep it. What I think about then is, it's really interesting that the word, and the histories of the women that you encounter, right? As you realize that this process of realizing, well, my suffering is not necessarily unique. It's singular in my first person experience of it. It's the first time I'm doing it, but other people lived it before. And I think of it, I don't want to misparaphrase in another quote, but that line from Baldwin, like when he goes into a library and he realizes, oh, actually my pain is not just singular. Others have lived this
and
too.
then you read, that line.
And so it's part of it, I think, as we talk about like moving through different explanatory schemas or different discourses or different regimes of identification, that's both interesting and good in its own right. I mean, it could produce some kind of stasis, but it also seems to be a type of engagement with others or a dialogic practice, right? Or at least it's some sort of, well, it's grounding your experiences or like it's a giving a name to your experiences in ongoing dynamic conversation with people who exist in a shared world, right? There's these touchstones in some ways. And so someone goes, oh, I've had this experience that I associate with my eating disorder, or whatever.
Yeah.
Right? I fell into a dead end reading André Gide when I was, on the Upper West Side waiting for girls to call and they never did, or something like some other, like these things that are very contingent suddenly become real, right? I find it makes sense to me somehow as like a parsimonious psychic solution, but like one that's like productive and generative and good, that the work that you would be doing that would tie together both the personal mechanisms of like finding yourself or like work in an idiom that does not do violence to yourself, right? And also to connect with others, and in a political way with all the valences too, to do essentially the creation of these texts, which are all about a type of hiding and revealing, but in which you can arrive at a revealed thing. And part of what I think is very striking about the work you do too, is that part of what you narrate as centering and what you detect as centering in the biographies of the women you narrate is a desire to make as touchstones aspects of shared experience, and specifically women's experiences and experiences of gender and other minorities, into touchstones by putting them in these texts. So I think it's like it's more than any of those other previous things. It feels like a movement into a realm of shared intelligibility and connection, while still preserving some of these layers of like hiding and clues making.
Well, to put well, that's the thing about puzzle making, right? It's like you're trying to both stump the solver and also have them solve the puzzle. That it's not a good puzzle. It's not a good puzzle if either one of those happens without the other, right? To put a really fine point on what you're saying is the center of the book is both my sort of encounter with the French feminists as a one possible way forward through trying to find a kind of connection to a feminist movement that that I can attach feeling to in ways that didn't feel like I could attach feeling to sort of more American modes, whether, and I go into them somewhat in the book as well, whether it's like political lesbianism or consciousness raising movements, right? So their centerpiece of the book is both finding the French feminist, but also like very importantly going to inpatient treatment for my eating disorder.
Yes.
And which happened around the same time. It's also around the same time that I published the first puzzle in the Times and start being looked at to write women's crosswords.
Yeah.
And trying to like inscribe something like women's work into the puzzle form.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why I got so lucky at the particular treatment center I went to, but like everyone there was a woman committed to their recovery. And for all of my identification with this kind of smug French feminist sensibility, like I didn't have a lot of women friends at this point in my life. Mm-hmm. I had like my very concerned mother, and that's just about it. Mm-hmm. And a therapist who had just broken up with me. So it was there both in, that and this is going to maybe reproduce an overly simplistic sort of division between thinking and feeling, but it was there that I actually like started to really feel with other women.
Yeah.
This would have been a total surprise to me at the start of treatment, but it was actually group therapy that was most conducive to my recovery than any other like modality. It's certainly not all of the Freud I've been reading since I was 15.
Yeah.
But then there was also behavioral intervention that was really important, like just sitting and eating 6 times a day with these other women for whom eating had become a battle.
Right.
We can get into more why group therapy and behavioral intervention, as opposed to say Freud or Lacan, were actually, I think, what like helped push me into recovery. And you could take from that story that like psychoanalysis was just sort of like a narcissistic wound that I was, or like fed my narcissistic wound as opposed to these other models. But I don't think that's really right. I think that all of it was really sort of essential to my, as you say, like allowing for some parts of myself to be hidden and revealed in connection with other women. Like I didn't have to just like become a patient in group therapy. There's still like forms of individuation that can happen. But I was the first time that I ever really felt connected to other women, not just or only reading the French feminists who in many ways also were like not identifying with other women.
So one of the reasons, we've been so excited to talk with you about Riddles of the Sphinx is to get into the chapter where you just really no holds barred get into a discussion about French feminist psychoanalytic thought. And I was hoping that we can, not in like the mode of interview exactly, but in the mode of like collective pedagogy / ground clearing. We've been getting actually quite a lot of requests ever since we started talking about Lacan from listeners to talk a little bit about, in particular, Julia Kristeva and Luce Irigaray, who are both psychoanalysts, but also in this group of, quote unquote French feminists is Hélène Cixous. I will just say that the reason I was making that joke about like not all French, not all feminists is that Cixous, these people are all still alive. They're in their 80s and 90s at this point. But Kristeva is Bulgarian, Cixous is Algerian, and Irigaray is Belgian. They're all writing in French. Like that's where the nomenclature comes from. And they're all in one way or another, often in some extremely reactive and negative ways, engage deeply with the work of Jacques Lacan. So like we're all kind of in the Lacanian sandbox here. So what do people need to know for like little beginning bits on Kristeva, Irigaray, Cixous? And we can, kind of lean into the parts of these thinkers that are important for your book.
Yeah. See how to start. I had sort of talked about how they seem to present this path forward for feminist thought in a way that offered something that wasn't simple. Right? I think there's something that American feminism is something American feminism has always had to contend with, sometimes from feminists themselves, which is that feminism is simple-minded, right? That there's something that is, I think that I was thinking particularly about Sontag, sort of famously talked about American feminists as simple-minded. There is something about agitation, feminist agitation, that seems sort of, again, almost too simple to be valid. Right? Like we have want, we have needs, which are so just universally denied, and then lead to all sorts of contortions, right? Like the one that I grew up with is, I'm not a feminist, but right? Right?
Yeah. But I believe that women should have equal rights.
Equal rights, yeah. Exactly, right.
Right.
And so something about these three figures whose writing Cixous is probably the easiest to get into, and so that's where I like to start.
Do it. I know less about Cixous and more about the other two, so well, division of labor.
Well, great, excellent. That's perfect for me. But they all their best repudiation to that accusation that feminism is simple-minded is basically like, well, then I dare you to read me,
Yep.
Because their writing is not just really dense in the sort of Lacanian mode, but it's really playful in a Lacanian mode too. Yeah. So it's like, I dare you to call me either simple-minded or self-serious, right? These are the two feminist crimes. Yeah. So Cixous' essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, establishes this term that became really important for me. And I think, as you'll see, it's sort of in keeping with this sort of question about what is women's language, and what is how might playing with language actually be political, right? Yeah. Which is something that I was thinking about as I was asked to write women's crossword puzzles, right? Right. She defines this term in Laugh of the Medusa called écriture féminine, which is often left untranslated. Yeah. But loosely translates to feminine writing or women's writing. Mm-hmm. But in keeping with both sort of deconstructive mode that it's the sort of intellectual milieu that they're being trained in and working in, part of the idea of The Laugh of the Medusa is that it is through playing with language that one can unsettle the rigidity of masculine language. Yeah. And so she has a couple of really incredible riffs. I mean, she's inspired by Derrida and Lacan, and so riffing is method in a way, right? And so she talks about masculine language as analogous to man's libidinal economy, which means that she says masculine language is defined by thrift, right? Just like man's libidinal economy is thrifty. So what does it mean to say that man's libidinal economy and masculine language is thrifty? It means that language can kind of be stabilized, that there is something that's, we'd call it symbolic law, or the phallus, right? Can say, this word means this and this word means this. There are certain prohibitions. This is good. This is bad. This is turned on. This is turned off. You can see how the libidinal economy gets mapped onto this thriftiness, right? Like the meaning of words is as clear as the meaning of an erection. And the French feminists are not above dick jokes at all. Everything is kind of an elaborate dick joke, or the pervasive metaphors that the body and the body of language can sort of be understood together, that man's language is either rigid or soft, right? We know the meaning of words because they are singular. And then women's language, by contrast, spends, wastes, right? She talks about women's language, or écriture féminine, as unthinking language, but it's a pun. Like everything in all of these, in for these thinkers, it's a pun on dépenser, unthinks, which means, right, dépenser, unthink, but also dépenser, to spend, right? Yeah. Women are profligate with language. Yeah. And so
women be shopping, but with language.
Women be shopping, but with language. Exactly.
Yes, women be doing the phatic function of language is how Roman Jakobson would say it. Sorry.
Yeah, right. But of course, even this stereotype that women's political power is as consumers is also, they're playing on that too, right?
Totally.
They also enjoin women to not be proper, but not be property, right? Like everything is a play on words, but there's real significance in all of this signification, right?
Yeah.
You know, there's a sort of sense throughout so much of their writing, like, hey, could they possibly be serious?
Yeah.
And it's that is the threshold that they kind of always want to take you up to.
Yeah.
Can they possibly be serious?
Mm-hmm.
Which is the flip side of the I dare you to read me, right? Like,
Yes.
I dare you to take me seriously. As I'm being so profligate with words, as I'm actually taking wordplay so seriously. Like, yes, women unthink language. We're wasteful. And the fact that these all are like all of these meanings and all of these cliches and slurs are encoded in language. Like, yeah, trace us to the letter. We take language seriously. And in order to do that, we play with it. I mean, that's the Cixous has a line about talking. She enjoins women to break up the truth with laughter.
Yeah.
And if truth here is understood as like phallic law, the name of the father, what she literally means is like play with language as much as possible. Just pun and pun your way out of patriarchy, which is sort of like was obviously appealing to me as a young cruciverbalist, right?
Yeah.
Who's also trying to reconcile like how to be a feminist with the fear that I will not be taken seriously or I will be seen as self-serious.
Yes. No, who takes play more seriously than a psychoanalyst, right? You know, there is that.
Yeah. I mean, even I think this is part of the maybe unfortunate legacy of these thinkers, but also Lacan and Derrida, that when we encounter as Americans, and this is like, I don't know, a function of a large anti-intellectual streak in American culture, that when we hear terms like phallogocentrism, we hear these sort of like loaded, forbidding, theory speak compounds that couldn't be meaningful, right? Because they're so esoteric, as opposed to thinking of them as acts of wordplay. Mm-hmm. Specifically in the context of phallogocentrism, right? The idea that not only is our culture phallocentric, right? Like we're crafted for the sake of patriarchy, right? Crafted for the benefit of men, but also logocentric, that we live in a culture that where we've adopted a history of Western thought from Plato to Heidegger that understands subjectivity as like singular and man as a thinking rational being, and that by pushing them together, there's one single, almost Joycean portmanteau that they need to break up with laughter, which is phallogocentrism, right? Which is the idea that no, subjectivity is plural, language is plural, the erotic body is plural, and that there's actually like a politics in all of this that can be grasped or mined or disruptively, riotously funny. If we play with language. But none of that is captured when it's, terms like phallogocentrism are just understood to be like, I don't know, sort of intellectual virtue signals on American campuses. Yeah. There's nothing virtuous about any of this.
No. Yeah, it's one way to think about it, I think, that may be helpful, but for us and for our listeners, right, is this thought about like, I think the reason why a lot of these terms don't land, or they land as duds, or people treat them as buzzwords, is that they arrive as buzzwords or as like, well, this is how we need to name something else, but not change. In other words, they're packaged as units without being presented as, well, actually, this is a deliberate choice of words that are produced as a result of a coherent or at least cohesive and pretty thorough critique of what is understood to be language and meaning production more generally.
Yeah.
And so, like, I think, to give an example, and here I kind of want to appeal to also the way in which, like, what we said about the French feminists, like this, like, is this playful? Is this serious? Am I supposed to take this seriously? How seriously are you taking it? We might think about reading some stuff in Freud early on, right? And I'm thinking particularly like his theories of development, right? In the 3 essays and extra, right? Which is, just I know you both know this, but just to gloss for our audience, for anyone who might not, right? The whole narrative essentially is like presented as this is the rules for how little boys and little girls, the only two options, develop. And the entire thing is told as like a narrative, by Freud. But if you read it with any degree of critical faculty, you realize, it's written from the perspective or from the base perspective of a young boy, insofar as a lot of the dramas and like the difficulties of psychic work that are put on the little boy position, the little girl position, all boil down to boy has this thing between his legs. It is presence. He encounters girl who is quote unquote, no, she's not. She doesn't have something else. Right? She is lacking something and it has been taken away, and that's a threat. Right. And so in other words, and this is where we get penis envy. This is where we get weird contortions.
And the castration complex.
Yeah. Or people are like, well, my baby is the young woman's baby is her penis. Like these weird, very literalizing sort of things. And you're like, is this serious or is this not serious?
Yeah.
What subsequent thinkers critiquing the Freudian legacy do, right? And here I think it's Ernest Jones and I think Carl Abraham too, right? Basically, and then subsequently these French feminists is when they use the term phallocentrism, they're trying to describe the way in which at the time regnant Freudian theories, logic of development is, as we have said, structured around the position of the penis. Mm-hmm. Basically, all the pathologies that a young girl can have are all about how she lacks a penis, and all the pathologies a young boy have relate to how he could lose it. In other words, there's a overall structural logic of like presence and absence, and like implicitly the absence is coded as lack, is coded as insufficiency, is coded as pathology. And critics will be like, well, this is clearly privileging for all sorts of reasons, whether it be with the description of presence or the relative lack of pathology, insofar as that the boy has to worry about losing something, but the girl's like, who took my penis from me, right? Or whatever Freud attributes to her, that are, well, misogynistic in their upshot, right? Both in the specific contents and in the thing that they produce a system that like oppresses women. And so the reason I'm mentioning this, right, is because what I take to be so significant in the careers of all three of the thinkers on the table, mm-hmm. right? Cixous, Irigaray, and Kristeva, and also in what you're turning to them, is this way in which they fuse their psychoanalytic perspective with what I guess we could call a broadly deconstructive attention to the way in which meaning is never just given and stable and singular, but is actually something that is, whether it's words themselves, has histories, etymologies, or also concepts that relate to those words that are bound up in histories and institutions of power, right? So it's the idea of an ongoing dynamic constitution of meaning that, well, presumably, and this is the deconstructionist critique, is marked by gestures at asserting itself that have to be continually occurring. And famously, just to gloss, I'm trying to do deconstruction in a nutshell for our audience, is this idea, much as with as we just gave the example about spending and thinking, penser and dépenser, right? The deconstructionist claim, what we call like deconstruction, is both something coming apart, right? The deconstructed mm-hmm. elements of if I were to serve you a very weird appetizer plate where like I took apart a chicken wing before I served it to you, and I'm like, this is a deconstructed chicken wing. You're like, oh, fuck you, right? But like you follow, like that's taken apart, disassembled. But
that's a real meaning now. That type of deconstructive cooking is meaningful. Like, those used to think it was just misappropriation, but I think that's in the dictionary now.
Just admit that you're describing a chicken tendy.
No, but I want the bones in the middle, like some Virginia O'Keeffe kind of painting kind of stuff. I do. Actually, tendies would be good. But it's also deconstruction. So it's about construction. And
right.
As a philosophy that has its roots in phenomenology, or as an orientation that has its roots in phenomenology, and in Hegelian continental philosophy and otherwise, like other sort of vectors, it is going to understand the ways in which meaning is constituted, or is like these processes of essentially the assertion of certain terms or concepts as being continually kind of haunted by their opposite. Right. And I think that so deconstruction imminently thus is not just a thing you do, it's a thing that's happened. The way words are built together involves a continued kind of tearing away or pushing with the opposite. Right. I know I'm doing violence here, both to my own complex background and to your expertise in English, but for the sake of tying this together for our audience, right, what I take a lot of the French feminists is doing, and what I take figures like Irigaray in particular is doing, is, and I hear this all as being so overdetermined too, with the ways in which you've used explanatory schemas, and like there's both this like access and revealing, this hiding and giving and like connection. that this logic of like essentially the way concepts are always sort of implying or tearing with their opposite.
Yeah.
Right. That precisely when we were think about like, I don't know, the anxieties of whiteness and how that's always related to some sort of abjected blackness, right?
Yeah.
Or the anxieties that men have vis-a-vis the womb or whatever, right? That as a phenomenological or linguistic or philosophical proposition resonates very profoundly with the idea that the repressed returns and that we're always kind of working with it one way or another. And to tie a tight bow on it, and hopefully without doing too much violence to this, I see the work of figures like Irigaray and Kristeva as sort of like, let's mount a like Western philosophy and the language that we associate with reason as like a case study in, on the one hand, erasing things that are coded as feminine or feminized or related to the fact of sexual difference. And on the other hand, like a pursuit of a schema that is universal and transparent and supposedly logical and has all its reasons, but which is in fact just as constitutively exclusive and as bound to repetitions of exclusion as like that Freudian theory where the presence of the penis is the presence of meaning, is the presence of superiority, is the presence of the word, etc.
I just wanted to bring this back to some of the preoccupations of Anna's book, also by way of saying one or two other things, particularly about Irigaray and Kristeva. You were talking, Anna, before about, like Sontag and other critics of American feminism as being in some ways like simple or simplistic. And another way of talking about that is preoccupied with issues of equality, right? And I think that if we want to paint with a really broad brush, we can also say that these three figures are obsessed with sexual difference, which is probably one of the main reasons that they're not really in vogue anymore. I also wanted to say that, one of the things that, and I feel like I don't know how to say this without it sounding kind of like icky, but I'm just going to go for it anyway, is that this is all about like embodiment, but like not in, like embodiment is still too abstract a word for like, you're talking about spending excess, but it's like fleshiness. It's like the fleshiness and sorry, like trigger warning for everybody who hates this word, moistness of language, right? There is this
everybody's
sort of
flowing and oozing. That's
Irigaray. Right. That's Irigaray. And so, on the one hand, there is this like, let us listen psychoanalytically to philosophical texts to make them yield up the feminine, but she's using all of this like really intensely biological language about like women's genitals to express this. Or when we get into, probably the two things that in the Anglophone world that Kristeva is best known for is one is like the idea of the abject, which has a lot to do with the maternal and things that aren't one and aren't two, which is also Irigaray's preoccupation, and thus that are like oozing and about wombs, right? And the semiotic, this idea that there is a part of language that is, unlike what Lacan is talking about, that's not the symbolic, that is not all about like the entrance into language and subjectivity, but that there is these pre-verbal sounds and noises. And it's messy and mucky, right? And that's part of what they're playing with. And this is also where, and you go through this, I think, really elegantly in the book, the ways in which this has been both rightly and wrongly taken to be a sort of essentialist project. And, it's interesting because we don't, and this is not about the book. This is my own sort of hobby horse that I've been, thinking about in various ways is, we certainly critique Marx for not like thinking about feminism, but we don't say like, oh, you can't have a theory that takes class to be like the most important form of difference. Whereas we have sort of, thinking about the forgotten women aspect of your book, these are all in some way kind of forgotten women because, especially for somebody like Irigaray, it's just like sexual difference is the most important form of difference, like in a really unapologetic way.
Yeah. linking the two things you both just said, I mean, this sort of contemporaneous American sociolinguistic obsession with like the neuter, or making words neutral, like spokesperson instead of spokesman, or chairperson instead of chairman, or just having the neutral pronoun be she or
yes,
they, right? Right at the same time, these movements in American feminism, to those movements, the French feminists would say like, good luck, good luck neutralizing language of sexual difference.
Yes.
I dare you.
Right. And also that's the masculine. You neutralize it, it's just masculine.
Right. Exactly. The other thing that, I mean, there's so much to say about the sort of progression to the flowy, oozy, not singular female body, right?
Right.
But I want to go back to what Patrick was saying about whether we can take any of it seriously, as in like literally, like, is there actually castration anxiety? Is there actually penis envy? There's a really strange tension in all of these texts about literalism, as distinguished from seriousness in a way. Like, literalism is to the letter, not to the anatomy, in a way that is then really complicated. They're like, when I'm talking about the labia, I'm not talking about women's genitalia, or like when I'm talking about the phallus, I'm not talking about the penis. But of course, they are talking about the kinds of symbols and signifiers that we have for everything in our culture that is obsessed with the literal penis.
Mm-hmm. Can I just say one thing here, just to ground out?
Not one. No, you may say not one thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a joke.
It's actually two things that I'm thinking about here. Just to on
good,
the level,
too,
like,
good.
Yeah,
one
at least two.
As a quote that I'm haunted by, right? Which I keep thinking about, which is a line from Sophocles, which I only know because it's like one of the first bits of Greek is like 4 words, but you can translate in a lot of different ways that when you're learning Greek, they make you do. And the phrase is either I write the words of women into water, or the words or oaths or promises of women are as if written in water, right? So there's the idea just that like their inscriptions or like the way they interface with language and legibility is like literally it's that oozing torrent of time that never, it's
exactly.
So like in some ways, like the thing to say, I guess I'm trying to get to the audience, is like when we're talking about phallogocentrism, we're really also talking, like, that's not just a buzzword. Like there is a legitimate recurrent kind of phobia of certain types of meaning making, associations of tropes of like slippery words, slippery women, loose words, loose women. Like it's all there, and it keeps repeating. And just to round this out, one other thing about the way in which, like, for some in the phallogocentric thing, the phallus is the center. I was recently sent this by a fan of the podcast who was talking. It's a computer science stuff I don't quite understand, but it involved like working through the layers of signification and how like semiotic processes work in ChatGPT models. And what this means basically is that at the core of ChatGPT, there has to be one signifier. This is describing this. By creating a custom embedding at the token centroid, the mean vector of all 50,000 JPTJ token embeddings, like this is the ultimate signifier, the core, prompting its model to define it and consider its possibility to construct any other definition tree, lies something that has been described as the average thing. However, the most probable branch in the tree, which gives a definition containing anything specific, defines that ghost token, the centroid, as, quote, a man's penis.
Incredible, right? The ghost token, the quilting point. Yeah. It's too perfect, but it's also perfect. And when we're talking about the libidinal economy as being metaphorically related to, but also really related to, like, it's this tension between the figurative and the literal. Or like the figurative is literal. This figurative notion of supremacy, of law, of order, the phallus, is also literally the center of the symbolic order of our signifying system.
Women write their words in water. We sign our Dixon Code, right? It's like it's that straightforwardly blunt.
Yeah. I mean, let's see, should we go back to Irigaray, or should I just also confess that one of the things that was so appealing to me about all of these texts is that they're taking the body very seriously as a signifying system, which of course as an anorexic you are as well, right? You are at some level trying to speak through the body in ways that you're not comfortable or unable to speak through language, perhaps because all the body has to say is something that's basic or basic bitch, I'm so sad, right? God forbid. But you're taking that signifying body really seriously. But also, and I think we've been getting at this somewhat, is that it's really kind of crass and funny and also sexy, or like that there's something about the female orgasm and about women's pleasure that is like liberatory or emancipatory and also like really, really, really heady at the same time. That was really appealing to me at this particular moment when I was trying to basically figure out, how do I reconcile being a feminist with being an anorexic, with being a virgin? Like, I was sort of like, how do I access this mythical thing called jouissance, which sounds fucking cool, while also trying to deny myself something like bodily pleasure, right? I'm not eating, and I'm trying to signify so much with my body. And it turns out that like what I don't want to be the answer is that I'm like subscribing to a masculine libidinal economy of thrift. I'd like to be wasteful, but that I actually like, that's terrifying, or it was terrifying to me at a time when it felt like the only way to indulge my appetites as much as I wanted to, my appetites for knowledge, my appetite for power, was to deny my appetite for food and to make my body say, I'm actually good. I'm actually have total mastery over this thing. I'm not gonna, I don't know, there was some sort of like imaginary identification with the French feminist project that, and specifically their project of feminine sexuality, is like highly intellectual. And figuratively attached to the women's sort of grotesquely appetiteful body, right? It was like, figuratively I'm attached to that. Literally I'm not eating. But figuratively I'm down for jouissance.
No, absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
Right. Which is just to say that they were a kind of like spiritual crutch or something, because there was no sense that like, in reading Irigaray, I'm going to start to actually enjoy my multiply erogenous body. It was like, or that I will enjoy it by proxy through her writing. Anyway.
Something that appeals to me deeply, and Irigaray was always like the figure that really mattered to me the most. In a lot of ways, I feel like I have a much more vexed relationship to Kristeva, partly because she's really doesn't identify as a feminist in a lot of ways, but this work that Irigaray does it's so beautiful. I mean, she's a gorgeous writer in French, and she has a really good translator. In all of its excessive signification, it's gorgeous, and it also says like, fuck off. Like, I will tell you everything, and also I will withhold everything. And it's really unapologetic about that.
If they're neither French nor feminists, they're serious edgelords on the page.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. But I think, at least for me, reading Irigaray, like that's how I got into psychoanalysis was reading Irigaray and reading her like textual fights with Jacques Lacan, who, kind of ruined her career in some ways, or at least early on, like expelled her from the University of Paris at Vincennes, the psychoanalysis department, which, if I could be a fly on the wall anywhere, somewhere in the 20th century, I would really be like, what was going on in that department? But, and made my way through some of the figures that you did also in going through Lacan, like, somebody that I hope we can talk about, which is Jane Gallop, who I feel like is really, like Kristeva and Irigaray and Cixous, is like really out of fashion. But hey, psychoanalysis was out of fashion when I was in college too. So, these things come in cycles. But, Jane Gallop comes up in Riddles of the Sphinx. And I think of her as another one. She's not like one of the figures that you choose as a.
I think she might be.
she's a crypto. She's a secretive. She's a secret lost feminist in Riddles of the Sphinx. And I was preparing for our conversation, and I was like, oh, we've actually cited Jane Gallop kind of a lot. Like when we've talked about the castration complex and the idea of having the phallus, she has these really, workaday, helpful, concrete examples of like, what does that mean to occupy the position of castration? I like her book, Reading Lacan. We've talked about her conception of like having a transference onto the field of psychoanalysis itself as this site that's going to yield up meaning. And The Daughter's Seduction, where she's talking about Lacan and the French feminists, it's great. It's so saucy. It's, she's the one where she's the person who's like, Lacan is a prick, like, but not in an ad hominem way, but maybe also in an ad hominem way. But like that is the function of what he's doing, as a writer, as I suppose a speaker in terms of the seminars. But she wrote this book that you talk about in Riddles of the Sphinx in 1997, Feminists Accused of Sexual Harassment. And she's a provocateur. As a writer, she's a provocateur. She writes this book, which I didn't know until I read Riddles of the Sphinx. It had gone into like multiple printings because I thought I was like the only person that ever, and I didn't even finish it because it's just so defensive. And it's Feminists Accused of Sexual Harassment. Well, I was trying to read it on the beach. It was not a
it wasn't a good
it was not a good beach read. But can we talk about like the work that Gallop does in your book and like, thinking about scandal and language and sex? Because
totally. Well, also just to back up slightly, there's one to just sort of ask why is there this section on the French feminists in your book about the history of the American crossword puzzle, right? There's one part of that is just biographical, right? Like I discovered the French feminists in college by way of a syllabus, not my own ingenuity. But, there's a very, for my purposes, extremely coy, but I think illustrative moment in Lacan's The Instance of the Letter in the Unconscious, where it's a bit of advice, right? It's a rare bit of practical. Yes. Yeah, it's a rare bit of practical advice, right? In his otherwise very cagey and cryptic writings, where he says, right? Do crossword puzzles. And then it says advice to a young psychoanalyst in training, right? This is his command to his audience. Do crossword puzzles. And then you will understand, presumably, that the unconscious is structured like a language, or that there is a signifying chain down which signification slides, right? To me, it was sort of like, again, how seriously do we take this? Which is just the perennial question of basically my relationship to all psychoanalysis, right? How seriously do we take this? And do we take it as more than a provocation? Is it actually prescriptive in some way?
Yeah.
There's a lot that I could say about that, and I think that a crossword puzzle is ultimately a pretty limited metaphor for the unconscious, but still a useful one, especially in the movement from Freud to Lacan. Think about Freud as operating or thinking of the unconscious as a kind of rebus puzzle, as sort of taking the images from dream work and translating them the way you would translate a rebus puzzle into language, like the I, heart, and why. The heart is the non-verbose said rebus, not by words, but by things, is the stand-in. Or there, like Highlights magazine used to have a bunch of rebuses. But that if the unconscious is no longer a rebus, but is instead a crossword puzzle in which nothing makes sense except in relation to the other words, on the chain of signification. That's getting back to what Patrick was saying, right? Just the basic deconstructive fact that every word is haunted by its opposite, or words in proximity, that there is no such thing as the masculine thrift of language as a conceit, as a fantasy, that words mean what they say. Then in a way, the crossword puzzle actually becomes a really generative metaphor, that we only can solve the downs if we have the acrosses, right? So that's one way to get into this chapter. Like, well, what if the puzzle of the unconscious was actually, what if somehow I was like cross training for analysis by solving a bunch of crossword puzzles? But the other way to get in was by thinking about, especially a figure like Gallop, who, like so many of the women in the book, find themselves in what I want to call like they're unbent, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. There's this woman crossword constructor and champion crossword solver named Ruth Von Cole, and who I write about, who was a lay Joyce scholar. She's a really strange person, was a real social conservative, but she wrote a haiku late in life that was then published in Harper's that said, "What a paradox is an unbending person who can't unbend." And I really love that because I think it actually provides this kind of motif for all of the women in the book, myself included, this kind of willful distortion of oneself into a kind of polemic or into a kind of politics that then leaves you totally stuck, unable to unbend. And I think Gallop is one of those people because, first of all, she's totally brilliant. I would like to go on the record as a fan of Jane Gallop's, and I know that that's a kind of I'm not sure there's many of them of our generation, whether they know her or whether they've just been taught that she's a kind of bad actor because of this book, of this book that she wrote, Feminist Accused of Sexual Harassment. But I think she's just an incredible American interpreter of French feminists and of Lacan.
Agreed.
And this particular essay that you mentioned, it's called "The Ladies' Man," and it's a chapter of the daughter's seduction. And it's just, you're right, it's saucy, it's kind of stupid in its own way, but it's also so brilliant.
Oh, it's really good.
It's a provocation. Like, if you, Lacan, are going to reduce all of human signification to the sign of a dick, I am too. And it's going to be the prick, not the phallus. And what the prick is for her, and she describes, she's like, it's not phallocentric. She says, it's phallo-eccentric. And to my mind, it's like, it's a brilliant analysis of a kind of masculinity that emerges in the 60s and that Lacan and Derrida are both emblematic of, which is a sort of like, I don't exactly know how to, it's not exactly the beta male figure or like the Woody Allen figure, but it's related, right? It's like someone who's if the law of the father and the phallus has to mask desire in order to maintain its authority, the prick is all desire. He's putting it out there. He's sort of like, maybe Woody Allen is not the worst example, right? It's sort of like almost annoyingly transparent about wanting.
Yes.
Wanting to be liked, wanting to be seen, wanting to be heard, right? And yet still lightly abusive to women. That's the prick, as opposed to the phallus, whose abuse of women is achieved through withholding, right? Saying you can't come in here, or you can't even see that I actually want you. The prick is like, well, the prick is like, it's like a troll, a figure that we've, that I've mentioned before. And I think it's a kind of brilliant analysis of Lacan, and also a way to show how much these signifiers, or like we see masculinity sliding down the signifying chain, like in the 70s from the phallus to the prick, right? Yeah. But what is then so strange about Gallop, and I think I'm very kind of sympathetic to in a way that maybe is impolitic, is that she, in the 90s, in the 80s, she's writing these completely brilliant books that are translating, critiquing, interpreting Lacan and the French feminists as we've been signaling them or describing them. But in the 90s, she writes this book called Feminist Accused of Sexual Harassment, where she describes it's first person. It's just describing her experience of being accused of sexual harassment by two of her women students. And she's very dismissive of these students. And it's also a defense of a feminist pedagogy that is almost like a feminist pedagogy of prickishness.
Yeah.
Totally. Like, what if being able to tease your students, toy with your students, demonstrate that you are desiring too? Essentially, what if the site of pedagogy wasn't the phallus, wasn't like this is rule and order, but was instead amorous and like erotic? Now, like, for very good reasons, we can't stomach that.
Yeah.
But as she describes in the book, she like entered into feminism and into her feminist politics and what she insists on describing as like the heady atmosphere of the classroom in the 60s, where everyone was fucking their professors and reading Lacan. And all of that was very conducive to her education, because subversion of phallic law or symbolic law was part of the work. And to her, that sexual harassment became a form of discrimination, or was understood and recognized as a form of discrimination. That to her is a feminist victory. But that it is, again, slippery, and the definition of sexual harassment ultimately becomes introducing any desire or amorous relations into the classroom. She wants to say, like, well, wait a second, aren't we just back to the phallus? Aren't we back to saying, like, desire, especially women's desire, must be X and not Y?
Yeah.
You know, and isn't sexual harassment, which used to be a victory for us heady feminists who fucked our professors, isn't it now the property of the Christian right, of patriarchy, of all sorts of people who would want women's desire to be sort of sanctioned in certain places and not others?
Yeah.
And you can see how, like, a career steeped in the works of Irigaray, Kristeva, Lacan, where unleashing women's desire is intellectually sophisticated and politically potent. You can see how defensible that all is. And I should just say, like, she writes about seduction. She's a very seductive writer as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's kind of her MO.
Yeah. There's actually a Janet Malcolm review in the New York Review of Books of feminist accused of sexual harassment that I was just stunned by when I read it, because it was also obviously from the 90s.
Wow.
And it was just like, well, I'm seduced, you know, like, I thought she was wrong, but by the time I read it, it was like, just sure, you know, like that's, I mean, it's really about her seductiveness as a writer, but it's also about the appeal of, or how she positions herself as a sort of stopgap to a kind of reactionary sanitizing of the classroom, and or is that as just being like one front of rolling back feminist progress. That's one way to see the book. Another way to see the book is like, okay, so she harassed her students as the prick, and now she's just like picking up the phallus of Duke University Press and like throwing it down and totally mortifying and humiliating her students through 5 printings, you know? And they're both valid, but when I think they're both valid personally. I might not, you know, be on the right side of history by saying they're both valid. But when I think about this trope or this figure of the unbending person who cannot unbend, like, to me, that's what feminists accuse of sexual harassment is. That she's like, I believe so strongly in this politics of the prick that I'm not even going to see the fact that what I've become is the phallus by picking up, you know, by writing this book.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to even see how much I'm doubling down on the humiliation or intimidation of my students.
Yeah.
Which, in the context of my own writing, or at least of this is a chapter I'm really trying to contend with the possibility of being a feminist anorexic, which, when she's talking about, well, feminist sexual harasser seems like a contradiction of terms. Like, well, so does a feminist anorexic. And what kinds of feminism can accommodate these contradictions? And should we ask feminism to accommodate these contradictions? Is sort of a somewhat open question, you know, that takes us into the next half of the book. Thank you guys. Can I make a request that you guys do a Seminar 20 like close read?
I'd love to do that.
Yeah, it might have to be a summer project.
Yeah, it'll be down the line, but I'd be down for that.
But that would be good.
Yeah, and if you ever want to come back to read something with us, please.
Totally. Standing invitation. Thank you so much for being here with us, Anna. It was such a delight. We loved the book. Yeah, there are like 100 things I want to talk to you more about, including your dissertation.
Actually, yeah.
Well, that makes one person.
You're all about. Right.
Well, thank you so much. Everybody, The Riddles of the Sphinx is out now, and you're going to want to pick up a copy.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness and would like to support the pod, this endeavor is entirely supported by our Patreon community. We love you all so much. If you would like to get 2 additional episodes per month, including our ongoing reading of the standard edition and some wild analysis where we really let down all our inhibitions and talk about contemporary cultural objects through the lens of psychoanalysis. Head on over to patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. Thanks, folks. We'll be back next week. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Anna Shechtman. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.